Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining the Proactive Procurement Part 1, How to Ask for and Get What You Need. So as people are entering the waiting room, I'll just do a bit of housekeeping and introduce myself. So my name is Lujane Altawara. I'm a program associate at the Center for Creative Land Recycling. I help develop and execute all of our events, workshops, webinars, and conferences. So while we're waiting for everyone to join, I will launch a poll. And it's just one question. Feel free, you're not required to answer it if you don't want to, but please answer it if you'd like to. So it has just been launched, so everyone please fill that out. And then just to go over some housekeeping, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We'll definitely have a Q&A at the end of this webinar. So you can also just save your questions for the end of the webinar. This presentation is being recorded and it will be sent out within a week or so with the slides and the recording. Okay, so now I'm happy to introduce our Senior Planning Consultant, Joelle Greenland, who will be presenting on proactive procurement and getting you all up to speed on how important procurement is and all the complexities that it comes with. She will make it easy and she will help you out. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Lujane. Yeah, I'm going to try to make it easy. We're going to also try to make it fun. Okay. So thank you, everyone, for tuning in. You have made your first step in understanding procurement, right? And maybe some of you are thinking the title is a misnomer and that it actually should be called the pain of procurement, but we're going to make sure that that changes. Okay. So this is day one. The next day is next week, and that gets into contract management, contracts, and effective grant management, as well as contractor management. So we're going to, are we good, Lujane, with the poll, or are you going to keep it up?
Yeah, so I'll end the poll, and then Joelle, if you want to take a quick look at the results.
I'm seeing everything coming in. It looks like there is a medium range. Some people, oh, we have two very confident people here at 5s. All right. I like the confidence there. And then the majority have said 3. Okay. I appreciate the honesty. That's good. Look, everybody learns with procurement. I learn all the time with stuff. And if anybody has ever talked with Jim Drummond from EPA, he is the guru of this stuff, and I can listen to Jim talk all day. So that being said, I'm going to probably click out of the poll. So let's get into proactive procurement. And Lujane already introduced you to me. So I'm a senior planning consultant with the Center for Creative Land Recycling. And CClear is a tab provider for regions 9 and 10. As you can see from the map here, there's tab providers across the United States. These are some of the services that CClear offers. And but we've got to get into procurement. So if you want to learn more about the Center for Creative Land Recycling, you can go to their website, which is, their link will be at the end of this presentation. So we've got a lot to cover. This is all that we're going to cover. And why, from the types of solicitations to the bid process to my takeaways. And I'm going to say right now, I'm not an attorney. I don't play an attorney on TV. These are my observations from the almost 30 years of doing various contracts, legal, litigation, planning, certified planner, and in Brownfields world. So procurement is one of those things that, whether you have an EPA Brownfield grants, which probably most of you are here because you have one and you are a grant recipient. But this webinar is going to go over all of procurement. Okay. So in particular, the federal funds. Okay. So let's get into it. First of all, procurement sounds like a very intimidating word, but it is simply the process of obtaining goods, services, products, right, to procure. And if you have a grant from EPA, at some point in time, you will need to procure for services, right? And so especially with assessments, phase ones, phase twos, reuse planning, community engagement, whatever it is, whatever the things that you have under your work plan, some of those services you're going to need to procure for. So if there's one thing that you get out of this webinar, it is this. These two documents. This document is the first link here on the left. This is EPA's best practice guide for procuring services, supplies, and equipment. And it is 27 pages long. And that is single-sided. It is not a long document, but it is dense. And by dense, I mean it has a lot of Code of Federal Regulations, or CFR, references. So if you're familiar with this, gold stars to you, because you should be. Print it and have it near you, because I probably refer to this on a daily basis. The second document is the one on the right here, this link. And this actually is a companion piece specifically referencing the competitive procurement method. Okay, this is the guidance because there were a lot of issues over the past few years. There have been issues with non-compliance. And because of that, this guidance came out and it gives specific examples. It addresses frequently asked questions. And this is another one that we will be referring to a lot through this webinar. Okay, so if you leave right now, please go get those documents, okay, and print them out. Review them, know them. They are your best buddies when it comes to procurement, okay? So why? Why do we procure? Well, you're going to say, Joelle, I need people because I don't know how to do this stuff. That's actually really not the why, right? The why to procure is, one, you have to do it, right? You must do it. But there's a bigger reason why you're doing it. And we're going to get into that in a little bit, okay? But if you're using federal grants, this first bullet point comes directly from this document, the best practices. And that is, at some point in time, you're going to need services. But according to when you have federal awards, if you're using private funds, have at it, okay? But if you're using federal funds, this is the guidance that you must follow, okay? So it's contained in what's called the Uniform Grant Guidance, right? Published at 2 CFR Part 200, or what's called the Super Circular. Now, if you've been around like I have, you know that word super circular. And we'll get into the history of that just a little bit so that you have a broader understanding of the super circular. But basically, if you have federal funds and you're procuring, you must follow these guidelines. Okay, so there's a must. And please note that when you come across contracts or agreements or whatever it is, be very cognizant of the words will, shall, must. These are words that you have to comply with, as opposed to would, could, encourage, right? So just be very cognizant of the wording. Must is not a word that you mess around with. Okay, you have to do it. And also, as far as the two other bullets come, it's also to ensure that there's open and free competition, right? There's no restrictions. It's fair for everyone. It's a level playing field. Everyone has the ability to answer your proposals, right? You don't have any restrictions. So, and the last thing is that it's a cross-cutting federal authority. And so what we mean by that is that it is, whether you have federal funds from EPA or HUD or transportation, fish and wildlife, these authorities, this one is an authority that cross-cuts and applies to all federal awards, okay? Such as the National Historic Act, NEPA, Endangered Species Act. Those are cross-cutting authorities, okay? So is this. The ultimate reason, probably why you're all here, I'm going to guess, if I had to wager a bet, is simply you want to be compliant, right? Nobody wants to be out of compliance with their solicitations, right? That's probably the worst thing you want to hear is EPA calls you or somebody calls you and says, I think your solicitation was not in compliance. And now you need to basically cancel the contract with your contractor, which no consultant wants to hear, right? By the way, we found out that our RFP was actually not compliant with 2 CFR 200, and therefore we have to terminate your agreement. We have to reissue the RFP and do this whole thing over again. And you can't recompete unless we completely redo the RFP, right? So compliance is probably the ultimate destination, right? That's the ultimate reason. And I get it. So the tenets of procurement, like I said, I'm not an attorney. The tenets, these are my tenets. Somebody had asked me, this is the 4th time I'm doing this presentation. And I'm doing it only because I feel that this is really, well, number one, it's probably the most sought out technical assistance that I'm asked is about procurement, right? Whether I'm reviewing RFPs, RFQs, procurement is always on the top 3 questions. So the reason why I'm doing this is to spread, knowledge and to make sure that people have agency over their grants and over procurement so that they have enough information to make them feel confident in their solicitations, that if they're not, that they know enough to ask questions and be able to have a conversation about procurement so that they remain compliant. Okay. So first of all, the tenets of procurement to me are that you have a clear understanding of what you need and want. Previously, I just said, why do we do procurement? You need to know what you want, right? It's not just, okay, Joelle, I hear you, and I'm always about the why, right? Everybody, if anybody's worked with me, I'm always about the why. Why are you doing this, right? So the why with procurement is, it's not just, well, we need to get assessments done. We need an environmental consultant. The why behind procurement is, what are the needs and wants of your community? What are those outcomes and outputs that you originally had in your work plan? So it's basically, you want a partnership, and I'm going to get into this in day 2, with your consultant. Your consultant is there to help you get to your outcomes and outputs, right? It's not just ticking a box of, yay, we did, 20 phase 1s and we've done 8 phase 2s. It's more than that. It's getting you to the next level. It's getting you to the vertical development and to that end user. And it might not be vertical development. It may be horizontal development. It may be land restoration. Whatever that is, your procurement, the purpose is to get you to those goals. So if you're not asking in your scope of work the things that you are needing, right, to get you there, then you have to, take a step back and just make sure that the reason why you're doing the procurement now, which is one of the things as far as timeline and process, which is the 3rd budget. I'm already getting into that section. The 3rd bullet is understanding your timeline and process, right? Of course, you have to know the rules and regulations, and we're going to get into that shortly. But that is a very important thing so that you don't trip up your procurement. But understanding your timeline and the process that's involved. So if you understand the process of procurement, it's not a very quick, people, well, depending on whether, the 5 methods, what method you're using, whether it's a micro purchase, if you're doing a competitive process, it's going to take a little longer, right? If you need or you have a window of opportunity for doing assessments, maybe it's weather, maybe it's political environment, you have to get something done right away. Knowing that timeline is going to inform your procurement process, right? If you say to me, we're doing this now because we have to, we were told that we need to get a QEP on board like right away. And I'm going to say, do you have your evaluation team prepared? Are you ready? Is your house ready? Have you prepared your house for this grant? And what that means is your internal capacity. So your consultant, when they come on, they want to make sure, or they're happier, if you will, because I've been in both private sector and public sector. And I can tell you, in the private sector, you want to make sure that you're on the same page as your client, right? And if you come into very, you know, a lot of chaos, things aren't really in place yet, then that's going to make it a little bit more difficult. It won't be as efficient, and you're going to need to take a couple of steps backwards in order to get you to the place where you need to go in order to get to the things you need to do, right? Okay. So I've gone over some of those bullets, but you know, the procurement team itself, and that's, you know, I've said here, the reviewers, the evaluators, the facilitator, they need to be knowledgeable, they need to be unbiased, right? Everybody has their favorite consultants, but you need to have unbiasedism so that you have a defensible procurement process. And by that, document, document, document. The whole process, the scoring sheets, everything needs to be, you know, kept. And if it ever needs to be reviewed, if anybody challenges your solicitation, you have the documentation to support your selection of that firm. And I've had appeals. I've had people ask me why that firm, or I've been audited, and I'm happy to, you know, hand over the file that basically says, here it is, here's everything, here's our independent evaluator, they were non-voting, here it all is, and I am completely confident that there will be no findings, okay? That's where we hope you're going to end up after you've gone through this webinar, okay? So document, document, document. Of course, you must, okay, I say this, but you also have to, okay? You must conduct your procurement in accordance with the minimum UGG requirements, Uniform Grant Guidance requirements, even if your own procurement system has less stringent standards. Joelle, what the heck does that mean? I'll tell you what it means. What it means is that if you have an internal policy and procedure in your internal P&Ps that say you only have to go out for 3 weeks. The UGG standards, if you have federal awards, right, federal funds you're using, says the minimum is 30 days. So just because your internal policies say, okay, well, you can go out for 3 weeks or 2 weeks. I've even seen them go down as few as 2 weeks. The UGG requirements say 30 days. Now that's in a competitive procurement, right? For over $250,000. We'll go over the simplified threshold, which is under 250,000, which does not have a 30-day requirement, okay? But that was just an example as far as a less stringent standard, okay? So those are just some of the tenets that I've, you know, in myself and my daily practice, okay? So let's get into the principles and regulations, right? Everybody get a big breath, big stretch. Whew, okay, here we go. Guiding principles and regulations. Think of it as a 3-prong, you know, fork or a 3-legged stool, okay? You have federal regulations, you have state, tribal, and local regulations, laws too. And then you have your internal policies and procedures, which is what I was just talking about in the last example. Okay, so with federal regulations, you have OMB, which is the Office of Management and Budget, and then you have Code of Federal Regulations, which is CFR. Now, those of you who are 5s probably understand OMB and CFR. Okay, so if you've ever come across those EPA forms that you get, they're really not EPA forms. If you look at the top, usually says OMB number whatever, right? That's the Office of Management and Budget. Okay, that's what that's referring to. Okay, and then you have you know, your Code of Federal Regulations, which we're going to go into, which is what I was referring to about the super circular. And then of course the other parts of the stool, right? Those 2 other legs that you have to be aware of. This webinar is only going to be talking about the federal regulations. You need to make sure that you're aware of the other 2, okay? We're going to get onto that last leg too. We're going to go over that as far as your internal regulations, because policies and procedures, you must have them. In fact, you must have written policies and procedures about your procurement methods prior to going out for your solicitation, okay? So who is OMB? Well, let's just quickly get into that. Office of Management and Budget is not just like some esoterical budget, place out there, right? It actually comes from the executive branch, and they are responsible for enforcing the laws or executive orders of the president. Okay, so this is the executive branch. And so they oversee the performance of federal agents. Somebody's got to be watching over the federal government, right? So that's OMB. Okay, so their main functions are the following. These are the following 5 functions that they have. I'm not going to go through them, but this is what OMB does. Okay. So the Code of Federal Regulations, this is the codification of the general and permanent rules published in the Federal Register. Now, if you've never, this is actually a fun point. If you've never gone to, and anything that's blue in this PowerPoint is hyperlinked, okay? So if you've never gone to the Federal Registry, this is actually pretty fun. This is published every morning, okay? Every day this comes out. It's a daily, kind of like a briefing, if you will, and it publishes every rule, proposed rule, decisions, investigations, meetings. It's all there. It's kind of fun to go through, because you'd be amazed about some of these proposed rules that are trying to come down through the pipeline. But in an effort to be transparent, the Federal Register publishes everything. Okay, so check that out if you ever have some time. It's kind of a wild read. So basically, once it's in the Federal Register, it basically is the permanent rules of the Federal Register go into the Code of Federal Regulations. Okay, and that's broken into titles, 50 titles and chapters, and subdivided, right? Subdivided into parts and stuff, right? So you've got areas and agencies. So what we're talking about is this example. Okay, so this is 40 CFR Part 33. Now, if we had a time, because we're putting a lot in an hour and 15 minutes, and I will not be talking for an hour and 15 minutes, we will have time to get to your questions. And if we don't, please put them in the chat, and we'll absolutely get back to everybody. I'm sure Lujane went over that. So if you do not know, if this does not look familiar to you, please pay attention. Okay, 40 CFR Part 33. So 40 is the title, right? Protection of Environment, and the CFR, Code of Federal Regulations, and Part 33 is referring to the participation by disadvantaged business enterprises in the United States. Okay, so that's how that works as far as CFRs. So when you see references, Code of Federal Regulation references, you're like, oh yeah, that's what Joelle was talking about. Okay, so it's a different title. Well, now wait a minute. So we had 2 CFR 200. Yes, that is a different title. That's Title 2, okay? And so there are different titles and there are different areas. So that will take you to various parts, and it's very, very specific, okay? So when you type in, if you ever have a CFR, simply put it into Google, and you will go to the Code of Federal Regulations and right to that specific part. If you don't have the subpart, you're going to unfortunately have to start at the very beginning and read through. So it's very, it's critical to have that subpart if you're looking for something very specific. You can see here that the DBE lives in parts 101 through 503, okay? But this entire, chapter about EPA is 1 through 1099. I don't know about you, but I don't really want to read all that, right? So I want to get down to the specifics that I'm talking about. So, but 40 CFR Part 33 should be very familiar to hopefully everyone, except the people who said 1. You got to pass, okay? But this is about DBE. So we'll talk about DBE because that's disadvantaged business enterprises, and that's a very important part of your solicitations, and it must also be included in your procurement, okay? So simply put, we've gone through the overall tenets, and now we've gone through the 2 regulations, okay? The OMB and also CFR. So simply put, OMB oversees the uniform administrative requirements, cost principles, and audit requirements for federal awards to non-federal entities, okay? And that guidance is simply called, right, UG, the 2 CFR Part 200 or the Super Circular. So just a little history, and it's actually kind of a cool history. Back when I was doing this, when I got into this, there was no Super Circular. The Super Circular actually came about on December 26th of 2013. Before that, in 2011, that administration said, you know what, this is kind of crazy. OMB, you have a number of circulars, 7 to be exact, A102, 110, 122, 50, they're all over the place. And they talked about the administrative requirements, the cost principles, and the audit requirements. 7 different circulars, okay? I remember them. It was just like you're going through them. There's 7 different ones. It's crazy. And so the government at that time said, we're going to consolidate these, okay, into one place so that we have a government-wide framework for everyone, right? Whatever federal agency it is, you're going to all just refer to this guide. And that's the Super Circular, okay? So you also had up until, I forget what the specific date was, but I do remember it was in 2017, I believe. Correct me if anybody on this call, you know, I'm not perfect. So if anybody remembers that also, any of your policies and procedures that have references to A102 or 50 or whatever they are, 122, 110, right? If you have references to those, you had a 2-year hiatus, basically a grace period from when this was enacted to make sure that your policies and procedures did not refer to any of those circulars, that they now only refer to 2 CFR 200, the Super Circular. And so you had until 2017 to make those changes. If not, when you got audited, if anybody has CDBG funds, if you're using HUD and you get those monitorings, okay? If they come in and they still see you using a reference to one of these circulars, that would be a finding, okay? So just make sure that your internal policies and procedures, if you have not reviewed them, see if they've included the 2 CFR Part 200 and not the references to the old circulars, okay? And it's really important. So in particular, the Part 200, these are the sections as far as procurement standards, 317, these are those subparts, 317 through 327, and then Part 1500, which deals with the full and open competitive requirements, which is extremely important. So when I'm looking at an RFP and the first recitals, you know, at the very beginning of the solicitation, it can be as simple as putting in the paragraph that says, hey, look, this is, you know, funding comes from an EPA Brownfields Grant, you know, that we received, you know, you can get as detailed if you want, and to say that we received these funds and that any proposals that are responding need to adhere to all federal, state, and local procurement standards, including but not limited to 2 CFR 200 and 1500, as well as 40 CFR 33, okay? It's basically all in a nutshell. It's out there, it's in the proposal, and it puts them on notice that all these things are required. So you're passing through those federal, you know, those cross-cutting federal authorities that are on you through your cooperative agreement. Now you're basically saying to them, you're making them aware that, hey, we have to abide by these. You have to abide by these too. And if you have subcontractors, they have to abide by them. Okay. So moving on to a very important subject, which is disadvantaged business enterprise. So I've mentioned it a couple of times. Folks might know this as MEBE WEBE. I did not speak Latin there. That is women. Okay, MEBE is minority business enterprise / WEBE, women business enterprise. If you've had a grant before and you've had to report annually. That's that annual report that you have to have your meeby-weeby that goes to your DBE coordinator once a year. This is when you must make, according to 40 CFR Part 33, you must make good faith efforts to contract with DBEs whenever procuring construction equipment, services and supplies under an EPA financial assistance agreement. Take note, must, okay? So good faith efforts, you say, Joelle, what are good faith efforts? We'll be getting to that. So you're essentially making sure that DBEs have an opportunity to compete for procurement, okay? You have to document the methods used also in your records, okay? So when you do select a firm, that contract that you have with the firm, the language here that's in italicized has to be in your contract with that firm. Okay, so make sure this language is in your contract. Let's get back to the good faith efforts. There are 6 of them. So in subpart C, there's that subpart, and you should now all be well versed in the Code of Federal Regulations and how they work. So in subpart C, this is where we get into they must make good faith efforts. I'm not going to go through the 6 good faith efforts here. You could have a whole webinar on DBE. And if you want to learn, there's plenty of webinars on disadvantaged business enterprises and the requirements, especially if you are a tribe. So anybody who is a tribe, pretty sure, but I believe you have to first make the first pass through with your solicitation to DBEs that are in your tribe, and then you can go out to the general with your solicitation. Okay, but if you are a tribe and you have questions, please get in touch, and we'll assist you with that further. Okay, there are intricacies to that one. So just be aware of DBE and the requirements. This is no joke. This is really important, okay? So the UGG standards, again, I'm not making this up. It comes from my wonderful guide here from EPA, which they update every single year. It is constantly kept up to date, okay? I believe this one, this is issue date November 22nd, but I believe it's even updated further, or I think that is the latest. So the UGG standards are right here. Do you notice all the musts? Every single one has a must in it, okay? So this slide is another one of those, if there was only one thing you take away, right? You must maintain written procurement policies and procedures covering the methods available under the regulations. And there are 5, okay? 5 methods of procurement, meaning you have to have written procurement policies and procedures prior to going out to for solicitation. You must have these in place for all 5 methods, okay? And we'll get into the methods in the next slides. Cost must be reasonable and necessary. I think that speaks for itself. You must have a system in place for administering contracts. It's not just, we'll write it on a piece of paper and or a napkin and just get it issued. You have to have a system in place for administering contracts. You must have written standards of conduct for internal and external conflicts of interest. There is a whole section on here on page 8 about conflicts of interest and what you need to have in your policies and procedures for that. And also you must maintain documentation addressing cost and price analysis and vendor selections where applicable based on the method of procurement. So cost and price analysis is huge. It is Appendix A, again, in my wonderful document here. So that's Appendix A, but a cost and price analysis, we'll go over. There's another tool that I'd like to make you aware of. It's very handy, and it helps with this cost and price analysis. But this cost and price analysis, what a lot of folks don't know is that you have to do an independent cost and price analysis prior to your solicitation, okay? what it's basically saying is, in layman's terms, is you want to have an understanding of how much it's going to cost before you get the proposals back, right? So, for example, I'm going to use an analogy. If I want to move to Portland, Oregon, okay? I know nothing about the houses in Portland, Oregon. I do know it's pricey, but I don't know how pricey, right? I'm going to maybe call a realtor friend out there, or maybe I have a friend out there who lives there and get some, quotes, or at least make sure that they have a solid background as to where they're getting their information from, right? Maybe I'll go to realtor.com or Zillow, right? And get an idea of how much things are going to cost prior to me flying out there and seeing if I can even buy a house, right? That kind of seems a little crazy. So the same sort of thing is being asked of, EPA is just saying, hey, you should do this so that you get an understanding of how much things are going to cost, so that when a phase one proposal, let's just say you need a phase one, right? Somebody comes back and says $15,000. Okay. If you haven't done your research, you'd be like, all right, I've never done one. Sure, whatever. But if there are any consultants, and I've seen the attendee list, I know there are consultants out there, you'd be like, what kind of phase one is that? Okay. Back when, I can remember phase ones, they were like $3,000 or less. Now, maybe they're 5,000, depending on, it could be even more, depending on what the conditions are, the site, who knows? It could be a huge site. You have no idea, right? Same thing with phase twos. It's like, how are we going to put a price on that? Well, they're just saying, how much does a senior scientist cost, or an engineer, right? So if you get 5 proposals back and 4 of them say, okay, our senior engineer is $185 an hour, right? Our tech costs, X. And then there's another firm that says, yeah, our senior engineer costs $295 an hour. Okay, there's an anomaly there, right? So you're just making yourself a little bit more aware of what the price is and the costs that could be encountered when you get your proposals back, so that you're not just doing things blindly. All right. That's the reasoning behind that. And if you want to learn more, which you should, it's in Appendix A of the best practices, right? For procuring, the EPA one. All right. So let's move into the procurement clause. So this might look familiar to folks who've been doing this for a bit. This was originally created by OMB to help people remember about the 5 methods of procurement. They have gotten away from the clause, but I find it to be extremely helpful in remembering the procurement methods. So under 2 CFR 200, there are 5 methods of procurement. Micro purchases, which used to be a threshold of $3,000, would you believe? And then it was raised to $10,000. That's what the threshold is right now. And we'll get into each one of these. The small purchases is basically under 250,000, which is called the simplified acquisition threshold. So that's a small purchase under 250,000. The sealed bids and competitive proposals are over 250,000. We really don't deal with sealed bids. Sealed bids, and I'll get into that in the next slide, the more intricacies of that's more of construction, and it's a fixed price. Competitive proposals is usually where most EPA grantees live, okay? The competitive proposals, it's over $250,000, okay? The sole source, I hesitate to, it's almost like the dew claw, okay, on a dog. It's almost like it shouldn't be there, right? It is there, but it is a very, very rare instance that you should be using sole source, okay? So essentially, I'm going to put those 2 documents up again because they're your best friends, but these 2 are an informal procurement process. These are more formal procurement processes. And then this one is no competition, right? Okay, but done very rarely. And there's There are certain requirements before you can sole source, okay? All right, now I know this is a very wordy slide. However, every word is very important, okay? So we've talked about purchase. The thing is, someone had asked me recently, well, can I do 4 $10,000 micro purchase agreements? And I said, no, you can't. Because one, you have to have equitable distribution, okay? And I've put it here twice. So it must be equitable distribution so that you're not just, you're getting around the simplified acquisition threshold. So simply put, the simplified acquisition threshold, there is no formal advertising. You just have to get a number of adequate number of sources. And according to EPA, they require at least three sources. So you can actually email 3 firms if it's under $250,000 for a specific service that you need, right? Without any formal advertising. Okay, that's the simplified acquisition threshold. I'm making these very simple. However, they are all explained, each one of them, in this guide, okay? The sealed bid I was talking about before, these are usually done with construction projects, purchasing equipment. It's a very firm fixed price, okay? Yes, there's an EPA, grant that's, you're saying it's an $800,000 multi-purpose, grant, but 700,000 is contractual. Well, that's a fixed price. Not necessarily. That's just saying that there's only $700,000 that's available for the tasks that are in the work plan, right? But you have specific services that you need where qualifications and technical approaches may be, more important than price considerations. Okay. And that's the difference. Okay. So you need to have a written method for conducting technical evaluations and requirements for recipient selection. Okay. So probably many of you are saying, I don't think we have that. Do we have that? I hope we have that, right? Or I'm not aware of all this. It's okay. Take a breath. It's all good. All right. If you don't have these things in place, start today, start tomorrow, and start to get them in place, okay? There's no gotcha moment on these things. It's basically making sure people are compliant, right? If there's nothing, oh my gosh, they intentionally did it. Nobody intentionally wakes up one day and says, you know what, I'm going to be non-compliant with my EPA grant, right? I don't think anybody gets up and says, you know what, today I'm going to use my car insurance. No, okay? So I don't think anybody's doing it purposely, right? Trying to get around the system. And if you are, well, that's a whole different webinar, right? Okay. So the best thing you should do, right, is ask questions, talk to your procurement people, legal, your boss, your decision makers, your EPA grants manager, project officer. Have a conversation and say, I think there are certain things that are maybe not totally like in line with something that we're supposed to be doing, but and also talk to your tab providers, right? We've got people on this webinar across the country here. Talk to your tab providers, right? Talk to other brownfield, grant recipients, okay? Don't reinvent the wheel. There are plenty of policies and procedures out there that you can use to help you, guide you in creating your own, okay? That fit your community or your organization. Okay. We're going to move on. Sole source, right? So this is rare. Potential justification. There's a lot of things you have to do to get through with sole sourcing. All right. IGAs. Okay. Going to simply put, it's EPA encourages this because it is a really simple method that if your state already has a list of consultants who they've already done a competitive process, you can put an IGA in place or an MOU, right? That piggybacks, memorandum of understanding, that piggybacks off theirs, and then you don't have to compete, okay? You don't have to do your own competitive process. It's kind of slick. So look into this if you're interested. Okay, very quickly, because I'm looking at the time and we still have 13 slides to get through, essentially a little more like 10. Okay, RFPs versus RFQs. Simply put, RFPs, you get one firm, and RFQ, you get a stable of consultants, right? Depending on which one you go with, right? Both must have and account for reasonableness of cost and price, okay? This is also its own webinar. So if you have any questions about RFPs and RFQs, just know that RFQs provides a stable of consultants that you can pick from, but you still have to deal with price and cost. And usually if you have various, sites that have different needs, maybe you have asbestos abatement, maybe you have lead, maybe you have PCBs, maybe you have volatile organic compounds, whatever. I have done RFQs and it's helped me just as far as making sure things go faster because I have a bunch of consultants I can, throw out to, and work gets done, kind of concurrently, if you will. All right. But that doesn't say that there's, one firm out there that can do it all. Who knows? All right. So as far as that cost analysis, look at Appendix A. I've already mentioned that. The other thing is the analysis of brownfield costs. Community Lattice. They put together this wonderful ABC tool. I am not a part of Community Lattice, okay, so I'm not sponsored by them, but this tool was brought to our attention, and they basically took data from ACRES, the Brownfields database that EPA has, right, and put everything together as far as the cost of phase ones, phase twos, and this is a great tool to get an idea. Remember that cost price analysis to get an idea of what phase ones cost, phase twos. Really nifty tool. So big shout out there. That's really helpful. Okay, this is another one, another takeaway from this PowerPoint. There was one slide, right? There's no wiggle room here. Okay, so do not seek or accept. I think everybody knows this, right? Any assistance or guidance from a contractor in preparing an RFP, right? Don't even make sure that if you even get a sample from someone, right? Maybe another municipality, that you ask them, where did you get this from? How was this developed? Okay, because if they tell you, oh, ABC firm provided it to me, guess what? Even though they didn't provide it to you, that could get you into trouble. So, you can read all these. The number one thing, whoops. Okay, the number one thing, there we go. The number one thing that everybody gets into trouble with, I can tell you right now, with hands down, is the restriction of language. And by this, here's an example, okay? The example is stating that you only seek firms with experience with EPA Brownfields grants limits the competition. Such a restriction is inconsistent with 2 CFR 200.319B1 in that it does not allow firms that have experience in addressing contaminated properties or new firms, right, but not necessary EPA Brownfield grants from entering the market to compete, okay? That is probably the one that I see the most is people saying that you have to have experience with brownfield grants or something similar to this program, right? Or that they say you have to be within so many miles of the site, or you have to be in these boundaries. Those are restrictions and they are not allowed, okay? And they are inconsistent. And when they're inconsistent, according to the EPA, when you are inconsistent, it says, if you have already selected a contractor, but the procurement process did not incorporate the factors outlined above, which is all this. Now, this is the competitive one. This is not below the simplified threshold. It's not the micro purchase, right? It's the competitive one. Then the process you completed to select a contractor was not compliant with the federal regulations in 2 CFR Part 200 and CFR Part 1500. If this happened, you must immediately notify your EPA project officer and prepare and issue a new RFP, RFQ that is compliant with federal procurement regulations. Don't shoot the messenger. Okay, moving on. Developing a scope of work. Okay, so now we've talked about the tenets of procurement, the regulations. We've talked about some of the do's and don'ts, DBE and RFPs, RFQs, right? And now the scope of work is really what are the components? And here are some of the components that I have seen and feel that are the most important. Making sure that you understand, getting back to what I was saying, as far as the importance of having a really good synergistic relationship with your consultant so that you meet your goals, your outcomes, your outputs, right? But essentially, the goals of your community and what you want to do with this project, right? It's not enough to just say, well, we just want to, complete some assessments and and spend this money, right? It should be a little bit more of connecting with the bigger overall resource roadmap and comprehensive plan, or your SEDS, your comprehensive economic development strategy. Something you have to go back to the reason why you even applied for the grant, right? And usually that means going back to the community. Okay, so a scope of work is really important. And on the other flip side is knowing your boundaries of your scope, right? No consultant wants to start and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, hey, can you do X, Y, and Z? And it's like, that wasn't in the original scope. So there's going to have to be an amendment. Nobody likes scope creeping, right? Make sure that you understand tasks and responsibilities, as well as your own, as the client, your responsibilities in the relationship. Right? Having clear expectations. What are the channels, the frequency, who's going to be the contacts for the organization and the firm. The quality assurance. What are your standards? Hey, they gave it to me in a PDF. Well, did you ask them that you wanted it in Word, or you wanted it in InDesign, or you didn't want it in InDesign? Those kind of conversations really help set up a really successful relationship and a long-lasting one too. So legal and compliance is always there, right? Appendices, we'll get into more of that stuff in day 2. So developing the scope is really, really important. For instance, I've already talked about lining up with the overall goals, but, here's in the example that we had provided to another audience. It's understanding the extent of contamination, right? And so we gave these examples, and one of the people that we have on the CClear roster of consultants is also my colleague, Tamara Cardona-Merrick, who is an environmental scientist, and she can also help with developing scope of work, especially when it gets complicated with specific, certain contaminants, or what are the mediums that you're dealing with, especially with vapor intrusion, or the end results that you want, like if you want housing and stuff, and how that's going to the possible contaminants and how that could affect reuse options. Okay, so building a solicitation, right? These are some of the things that you need to just keep in mind when you're building that solicitation, right? The bid process. So the bid process is very different between the 250, under 250, and over 250. So these are under 250, right? 3, we've already talked about this. There's no formal advertising. You don't have to select the lowest bid, but you have to justify it. And that should always be done in your documentation. Okay. When you're over, this is what this guide is about, right? This 2-pager, open and free competition. Have to publish it, right? We've talked about this. Making sure that if somebody asks a question, you have to share the answer with everyone, okay? So have a designated time frame for those questions, and then provide the answers to everyone, okay? That's pretty much the way to make it fair for all those who are interested in providing a proposal, okay? Deadlines, you can have interviews. I always like having interviews. I also like having a cover letter. It's that personal touch that you have the ability to see a little bit more of whether the firm has done their homework on your community, and if they give a personal touch, okay? Evaluation and selection. These are example categories that come right from the second page of this document. Please do not say, right, various things that make it restrictive on the evaluation criteria. So the evaluation criteria must be in the solicitation. If you don't have an evaluation criteria, that's non-compliant, right? It must be weighted, percentages, points. It goes into how you do the evaluation right on this sheet here, okay? So these are example categories. You cannot say, hey, that you have experience with an EPA Brownfields grant, right? No, better to say you've demonstrated experience in addressing contaminated properties, right? These are very open and they allow anybody to compete. They're not restrictive. So, quick quiz. Yes, I didn't say that there was a quiz, but there is a quiz, okay? So, are there any improper procurement practices? And by a show of hands, if you think there is, put up your little hand. I'm going to give you 5 seconds because I'm looking at the time here. Oh, yes. Oh, thank you. Thank you for all those hands. Yes, that's a violation. And I haven't talked about the next one. Okay, so do people still think this is, so if we change this one thing that I've circled, is there still a violation? Is there still a non-compliance issue? Put your hands down if you think it's all good if we got, experience with contaminated properties. Do you still think there's a violation? I say violation, but it's just a non-compliance issue, okay? All right, there is. The price reasonableness. The price reasonableness has to be a minimum score of 25 when there's a 100-point scale, okay? EPA. Now, it does say this, EPA recommends, but honestly, 25, okay? Just go with the 25, okay? So price reasonableness needs to be 25, and then obviously these need to be reworked. Okay, good job on that quiz. All right, so we're at our final 2 slides here. So evaluation and selection, right? Here are my tips, okay? Obviously, you have to have your internal policies and procedures. You have to have a knowledgeable, we've already talked about this, evaluation team, a facilitator that is non-voting, and you have to have a blind evaluation. That's just me, okay? Like, it's not going to look good if you have people talking about the proposals. You can talk about the proposals after you score them, okay? Me personally, I like to score them, and then I'm open for discussion. I give it to the facilitator, I say, here are my scores, and in the end, you can see firm A is the clear winner, 15, right? They did a great job on the interview, they knocked it out of the park, but if firm B was 93, you're going to definitely have a discussion, okay? You're definitely going to have a discussion, and it could be, I was in a selection panel where we were talking, and one score was really, really low, and we had all scored it very high. We're like, what happened? The person gave us insight into their experience with this firm, their personal experience, and we didn't know that. And so there was a lot of discussion, and we ended up basically not doing what we thought we were going to do. So just be open, but I would say score them individually, okay? So that you have your own thoughts, okay? Also, a tip here. If in your solicitation you say, hey, electronic copy, right, is to be given by such and such date by such and such a time, don't forget the, time zone. And then your evaluation team says, yeah, I need hard copies because I don't like looking, I can't do it on a computer, so I want hard copies. Okay, don't put yourself in front of a printer. So if you have your evaluation team beforehand and they say, yeah, I want hard copies, then put it in your proposal that you want hard copies, or you're going to be the one making the hard copies. All right. Okay. Please note, very important, debarment and suspension. Click on this. It's Sam. It's basically the most wanted, right? You can't be on this. You can't, just make sure that the firm that you are thinking about has not been debarred. Okay, that's really important. Internal controls, we've talked about this, okay, again and again and again. just check this out and also look into the guidelines as far as what kind of documents and internal controls you must have, okay? Takeaways, okay? Here are the big takeaways that I'm going to present to you. First and foremost, where are your funds coming from? If they're federal, then this applies. If they're not federal, then maybe state applies, maybe your local internal, okay? Just make sure you know where your funds are coming from, especially if you're like, oh no, we got it from the state, but maybe the state got it from the feds, okay? Make sure that you read your EPA cooperative agreement. I cannot stress this enough. There are 3 documents that you should be very, very familiar with. Your cooperative agreement, your terms and conditions, which are hyperlinked here. They are terms and conditions that go across all federal awards, but these terms and conditions are updated frequently. And so if you have a grant that's older, these terms and conditions are going to have certain dates for applicability. Check those out, the terms and conditions, and of course, your work plan, okay? Know your rules and regulations. I can't stress this enough. If you don't know them, ask someone. Consult with EPA grants management. When you got a grant, you had your project officer, your financial specialist, your grants management specialist, and your DBE coordinator. Okay, those are the 4 people that you really need to know and know what they can offer you and have a relationship with them as far as like, hi, this is me and I look forward to working with you, you know, just in case when you do have a problem, they know who you are and you're not trying to scramble, trying to find out who they are, right? Okay. Legal, you know, consult legal advisors, your governing body, mentors, obtain examples, but make sure you're not copying just to copy. Also, don't rush it or wing it. Just ask questions. Nobody's perfect. Nobody's trying to do a gotcha moment. But you got to ask. You got to ask the questions, okay? And don't. It's just procurement, okay? We're all here to learn. And your tab providers can assist too. If you don't know who your tab provider is, let us know. We'll get you in touch with them. Okay. With that, I know probably people have lots and lots of questions. And if we can't get to them, no worries. We can send out all the questions with all the answers. All right. So with that, I'm going to unshare or stop my sharing. And then we can open it up for questions.
Yeah, definitely. Before we open it up for questions, I'm going to launch that second poll.
Sure.
And yeah, so we'll wait about 20 seconds for people to answer that. It's the same question that you answered before the webinar. We're hoping to see an increase in the level of understanding, as well as we hope you had fun learning about procurement. It's
Yes.
dense subject, but Joelle is so wonderful at consolidating that information.
It's a bit fast. Honestly, guys, this is usually covered in not less than a half hour. So there was a lot, and thank you for hanging in there. And again, if you don't have full understanding, it is perfectly fine. Just, you now know where to go.
Exactly. Okay, so I'm gonna end the poll, and then Joelle, would you like to read out the results really quickly?
Well, I am so happy to see that we no longer have any ones, so that's great. And of course, now we have more people that have joined since we originally did, but we now have between 30, so majority of people are in 3, 4, and 5, but 3s are in 35%, 4s are in 39% now, and we have 16% at 5s. So I'm super happy that we have over 70%, 74% in the category of 3s and 4s. So that makes me super happy. And that's awesome that 6 more people feel that they're 5s. That's great.
Yeah, I agree.
And the 2s, don't worry, there's no shame being a 2. I was a 2, I was a 1 at one time. And honestly, it takes a lot to just understand procurement. I'm a CFR geek, so that's also one of my quirks.
Okay, great. Thank you everyone for filling out that poll question. So now we'll step into the Q&A. We have about 10 minutes left. I'll start with the questions that showed up in the chat, and then if anyone has any other questions, feel free to raise your hand, and then I'll call on you to unmute yourselves. So earlier in the webinar, Stephanie Elliott asked, does CClear provide RFP/RFQ package review?
Say that again?
Does CClear provide RFP/RFQ package
okay.
review?
Yes, we do review packages. Well, package, interesting. That threw me for a second. We do review RFPs, yes.
Okay.
And your project managers will review them if you ask them. It is not a requirement, just so you know, it is not a requirement to send your solicitations to EPA, but it's certainly highly recommended.
Great. Josh asked, is there a website that gives information on who receives grants?
Yes. Yes. Great question, Josh. Every year after the awards have been announced, EPA actually publishes all the winners and not successful grantees awards, and a copy of their grants the narrative sections are available. After right about a few weeks before the next RFA is posted, they will take that down. So it's up for several months. And then, of course, EPA publishes, there is a website, and we can send this out. There is a website for grant fact sheets. If you Google EPA grant fact sheets, that's a website that will show you every grant that has ever been issued since 1992.
Wow. What a record. Okay.
It's a different program back then, but yes.
Yeah. Okay, we'll be sure to send that out to you specifically, Josh, and then also include it in the follow-up email. Thank you, Joelle. Donna wanted to talk about independent evaluators. Donna, did you have a specific question regarding that? Or did you just want to learn more about that in general? If you're still on the call. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm still here. Thank you. Yes, I wanted to know the independent evaluators. I had kind of a multi question is how many people should be in the evaluation process? And the independent person, I mean, do they work for your firm? They have no understanding of what this is, and they come into it completely blind. Just a little more on that.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. Great question. The independent evaluator is a person, I call them that because they're not trying to sway anybody. They're just taking the scores. They can be someone in your organization. They're not voting, right? They're just literally facilitating, and that's a facilitator. So you have your evaluators, and then you have your facilitator, and they're the ones that are taking the scores, if you will, such that there's no biasism, if you will. Does that make sense?
Yes. How
many? Oh, 5. I find that 5 is like the sweet spot personally, but I've also seen a really good conversation with 3. It depends on your capacity. You may have a very small organization, right? But as a brownfields project, a program manager, I always had an independent evaluator or someone who was the facilitator, so that I wasn't involved with the scoring per se, or the actual, the final score. There was someone who was outside, and that usually came from human resources, or maybe I'd pull someone from economic development, or even public works, who basically has knowledge of procurement and how they work, and they just collected everything. They made sure that people were not, talking with one another while they were they would pick up all the documents again, and then eventually get it to where it was, a repository where everything was held.
Okay, thank you. That
Sure.
helps a lot. Thank you.
Thank you, Donna, for your question. The next question is if I attach my terms and conditions of the cooperative agreement or EPA RFA and or proposal, is that enough? Or what could possibly be wrong with doing that?
Attaching work plans can get you into trouble because here's the thing. If you have a consultant who, let's just say, helped you with the work plan in any way, I mean, as it could be really minute, but they helped you in some way on the work plan, but they plan on bidding, you know, on the work, on that solicitation, when you eventually get out to go get your consultant, that's going to be a problem if you attach the work plan, you know, in onto the RFP. That same firm now helped you with the work plan. So I personally do not recommend putting, you know, attaching work plans or cooperative agreements or any of that stuff onto the RFP. You can take bits and pieces of the work plan. And in fact, I've told people, just don't cut paste out of the work plan. Because honestly, guys, all the grants are public, okay? They're published. So, and most grantees are going to take their grant and they're going to pretty much take a lot of it and put it into the work plan, all right? So if a consultant has helped with that grant, you need to make sure that you've made it or made it different enough so it doesn't look like it's just a copy paste, if you will. You know, have broad categories. It also allows the opportunity for the consultant to then say, hey, this is our methodology. You know, we think we're going to work with you. And here is our rate sheet and then that, but this is our methodology. If I explain the methodology so prescriptive, it boxes people in and doesn't allow for that free open thinking, that free competition, right? Like to say, how would your firm do it? You know, what makes you different from firm A and firm B? It's going to make it really hard for the reviewers to see what are the differences, right? If you leave it open a little, then people can really kind of stretch out their wings and say, this is what makes our firm so unique and why we would be best to work with you.
I think we may need to move on just because we have 2 questions left.
Absolutely.
Thank you. So Trisha asked, how long can you use the pool of qualified consultants from an SOQ?
Oh, a loaded question. This is what gets into, and we probably don't have time, but it's called options-based. So options-based is also, options-based and something else. So options-based is something that you put into a procurement, you know, the solicitation, such that if you have another grant, you have the option to use that consultant again, but you still need to make sure their rates are reasonable, right? Okay. How long for an SOQ? One, what's your internal policy say? Okay, written procedures and policies, because you should have one that says, hey, we're going to do this and it's going to last for 5 years, right? Or it's going to last the lifetime of the grant, or it may be 3 years. Personally, in my CDBG grant that I used to, you know, run, we did them every 3 years where we'd go out for an RFQ because prices change so dramatically. That would be up to you, but as far as the SOQ, and you know, there's really no hard and fast rule. But I would say you have to have it in your written procurement policies and procedures, as well as in the solicitation about the length of time. I would say it's not 20 years or 5 years. Most of these grants, right, are at most 5 years. RLF could revolve, right? And you might get an extension, but you should always say that also in your solicitation about extensions and what your position is on them too. Hopefully that addresses that, Trisha.
Thank you, Joelle. So this last question, I know we're over time, so if you need to hop off, that's totally fine. But this last question is a 2-part question. So I'll start with the first part. How is it tactfully handled when we see a solicitation that might not be following requirements, such as the brownfield experience?
From whose point? Well, I won't put the person on the spot. So if you see, let's say you come across an RFP that says, must have experience, in evaluation, must have experience, with EPA Brownfields, grants, right? And you're like, what? Now, if you're a consultant who sees this and, you want to bid, but you don't have any experience, right? And you're like, wait a minute, I took that webinar and I'm pretty sure Joelle said, and now I've got this in front of me. You might just simply state and, send in an email to whoever, where it's been issued to say, I think that it appears that there might be a non-compliance issue according to 2 CFR 200 and attach the EPA guidance, right? And simply, they may not even know that they're non-compliant, right? So I always err on the, good intention side, right? To make them aware. So if you're the one, or maybe you got somebody's copy of their RFP and you're like, I'm pretty sure this is wrong in this evaluation. Whoever you got it from, you might want to have a conversation with them. So tactfully, everybody, I would hope everybody I would want to know if I'm non-compliant, like immediately. I've already read the bottom of this as far as if any of these things applied, right? Notify your project officer, right? Immediately. And, have a discussion, right? Because you will probably need to end the contract and resolicit. Nobody wants to resolicit, get it out now, because I've actually caught a number of them while they're in the solicitation, period. And at that time, hey, that's great, right? I know this doesn't sound great, but you have the opportunity to do an addendum, right? Amend it and talk to EPA. I've always, call them up and be like, I think I put this wrong. Okay, we'll do an addendum. We're going to take that out of the evaluation. We're going to make everyone aware. And if somebody has already submitted a proposal, you make them aware and give them the opportunity. Hey, do you want to change anything in the proposal? Right? We have an addendum. And then you extend the time period. Right? Okay. So it's not enough to be like, oh, well, that was 30 days and we put the addendum out. No, you're going to have to extend the time period, but extending it, for another 30 days or 3 weeks, depending on that's not a hard rule. Okay. You have to look at how much time has elapsed and everything. You've extended it, whatever time that is to extend it. I can guarantee you that it's going to be shorter than you having to do another recompete. Okay. So it's better to head it off right away.
Great, thank you.
Nobody likes being the bearer of bad news, but it's better to just do it properly, honestly.
You heard it here first, folks. Compliance is important. And then the second question was, this is the last question, but should a grantee do separate solicitations if they are awarded 2 grants in 1 year? For example, an assessment grant and a cleanup grant.
Gosh, unpacking that. I would say they're 2 different things. I mean, obviously, right? You have assessment and then you have cleanup. Cleanup, you already have your analysis of brownfields, cleanup alternatives, right? You have your APCA, and it's very specific as far as the cleanup. If you're in an area that maybe you don't have, there are parts of Alaska that are really hard to get to, right? Or there are areas they're very remote and there are few consultants. However, another one, conversation with your project manager, right? I would keep them separate, honestly. If you have low capacity, that's another reason on the other side, right? You're like, okay, well, we have an assessment grant, we have a cleanup grant. Maybe we could do one, solicitation and just say, okay, well, we need these services, right? Maybe there is one firm that can do it all. However, you run the risk of not getting enough proposals back that now you have to justify. Like, what if you only get one proposal back? Personally, I would keep them separate. And if you think that's a lot, at one time, and I'm not tooting my horn, okay? This is in my early career. I was handling 5 grants at one time. And this is when EPA grants were cleanup and they were hazardous and petroleum. They weren't mixed. And so it was like cleanup, hazardous, assessment, it was just like 5 of them and an RLF all at the same time. Okay. You can do 2 grants with 2, firms. Like it's not difficult. Is it a little bit more time consuming? Sure. But your mind frame, when you talk to the consultant, do an assessment, it's assessment. And that grant funds is only, we're talking in this meeting about assessment. Because as soon as you have one meeting that you're talking about assessment and cleanup, okay, now you have to figure out, okay, I talked to them for an hour. We talked about assessment. We talked about cleanup. Well, now you've got to split that meeting between the 2 grants. Okay. So it's going to get a little confusing. You might have a very clean, it would be cleaner to have a separation, if you will. Maybe the same firm gets the same, gets both. I don't know.
Awesome. Thank you, Joelle. So that concludes the part 1 webinar. Thank you all for joining us. Part 2 is scheduled for, oh, Scott, do you have a question? We are over time, so if you'd
Yeah,
like.
just real quick, is this going to be available for others to listen to?
Yes, definitely. So this recording will be uploaded to our YouTube and it will be sent out in a follow-up email within the next week. Awesome. So yeah, thank you all for joining us. Part 2 is next Wednesday, January 31st at 11 a.m. Pacific time. If you registered for part 1, you're registered for part 2. And yeah, if you have any questions, you can reach out to Joelle or to our general info@cclear.org. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.